Well, peace be with you, my brothers and sisters. Using the words again of St. Paul, the same words that he used when he was away from the community that he loved, but yet longed to reach out to them and to share his heart with them. St. Paul used to begin his letters with the words, peace be with you. And so to you, my friends and family at Christ the Redeemer Catholic Church in Thibodaux, Louisiana, I say peace be with you. Certainly it is a gift to be with you, even if it's just through the gift of technology. I assure you of my prayers, and I also assure you that my heart really anticipates rejoining you at the end of the summer and being back at Mass on the first weekend in August. Until then, I certainly hope that we are not only praying with each other, but certainly praying for each other. And as we use the daily readings at Mass to kind of feed our daily prayer life, I hope that the blog and the written reflections are things that are helpful for you. And certainly in the first talk, the first part of this series, I introduced that over the next 6 weeks, what we'll do is we'll look at the Gospels from the Sundays and ask the question, how is it that we can follow the Lord in our daily life? In part 1 of this series, we looked at the Gospel for the 12th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Luke chapter 9, and there we found Jesus not only asking the disciples, who do the people say that he is? Certainly Jesus also asked the disciples themselves, who do you say that I am? Not what do you think about what I'm saying, not what do you think about what I'm doing, but certainly the question that he asked those disciples is, who do you say that I am? What is my identity? In that first part, in the first talk, what we did is we asked, do we really believe that Jesus is who he says he is? Because if Jesus really is who he says he is, then really the only option that we have left is to look at the question of follow me. And do we want to follow him or do we not want to follow him? And we really left talk number 1 with that question, do we want to follow Jesus? Today, in this second talk, what I'd like to do is pick up on that same question and ask ourselves today, do we really want to follow Jesus? Do we really want to follow Jesus? I think we need to ask that question. And the reason is this, if we look at the rest of the series and we look at practical ways that we can follow Jesus in our daily life or practical things that we see in the scriptures or the words of Jesus himself, and we don't first ask ourselves if we want to follow Jesus, then I think that we can fall into the temptation of almost watching Jesus from afar rather than following him in the daily details of our daily life. I think it's much safer, it's much easier for us to remain detached from a dynamic relationship with Christ where it impacts our daily living rather than actually getting involved in a relationship with Christ, listening to his words and allowing him to shape the way that our lives unfold from there. I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, do we really want to follow Christ? Because we also find ourselves not only asking that question personally, but we find ourselves asking that question amidst the culture that we live in. And I have to share with you that I think that our Catholic conscience has become much more secularized and influenced by the culture that we live in rather than the gospel itself. I ended talk number 1 with a great quote from Pope Benedict XVI from his general audience in November of 2012. I'd like to go back to that. So if you look at the notes, number 1 for the notes for this talk, we pick up on the quote as he says, a particularly dangerous phenomenon for faith has arisen in our times. Indeed, a form of atheism exists which we define precisely as practical, in which the truths of faith or religious rights are not denied, but are merely deemed irrelevant to daily life, detached from life, pointless. It is that people often believe in God in a superficial manner and live as though God did not exist. Let's just stop right there before we actually finish the quote and unpack a few things that the Holy Father is trying to say. What he's trying to say is that I think we've become so familiar with the gospel. We've heard it so many times. We've become so familiar with the sacraments. We've gone to Mass so many times. We've become so familiar with the language of God. We've had those conversations so many times that as we get so familiar with something, we lose our awe for it. It no longer grabs us the way perhaps it did or they did when we first were introduced to them. And so it's not that the Holy Father is saying people are denying the truth or denying the sacraments or denying some of the fundamental things of what it means to be Catholic. They're not denying them, they're just deeming them irrelevant to daily life. So I think what happens is we go through the motions, and we go through the motions on Sunday or Saturday, and then what happens is when it comes to Monday through Friday, it's almost like the things that we were introduced to on the weekends are almost quote unquote irrelevant to our daily life Monday through Friday. That's what he's saying. And the Holy Father's saying that it's real easy for us to live as if God did not exist. It's real easy in the culture and in the country that we live in to go through our lives living as if God didn't exist, or living as if God didn't have any influence in the significant moments, decisions, or movements in our life. To continue with the quote, he says, "In the end, however, this way of life proves even more destructive because it leads to indifference to faith and to the question of God." Boy, I think it's just real easy for us to be surrounded by those in our life who are almost indifferent to the question or to the person of God. So when it comes to actually desiring to follow God, if the culture that we have is indifferent to God or is living as God doesn't exist, then man, an invitation to follow somebody who we are indifferent to or who we live like he doesn't exist, then of course it's going to be real hard for that invitation to follow him to pierce the secularized Catholic conscience if that does indeed describe in some way what we find ourselves surrounded by in our country. The second image that I'd like to present in these extended introductory remarks comes from a movie called The Matrix. It's a 1999 movie with Keanu Reeves, who stars as the main character, Neo. If you might give me the permission to spend a couple seconds illustrating what the movie is about, and then I'll make a connection for you. Basically, what's happened in the movie is there's been a great war between humanity and artificial intelligence. Humans had this massive war, this major war with computers, and computers won. Artificial intelligence won, and they have enslaved humanity. However, even though they won the war, artificial intelligence needs humans because they need a power source. They can't generate power on their own. So as they enslave humanity, they have built these massive farms and enslaving humanity so that they can use the energy that comes from the human body as the power source for the computers, for artificial intelligence. The way that they keep humans alive but yet docile in their enslavement is they just keep them asleep. So humans are living in this imaginary world which really doesn't exist, but they think it's real. And so because they think they're living in a world which actually doesn't exist, they don't put up a fight. They're asleep. They're almost living in a fantasy world that doesn't really exist, but they think it's real. There comes a point in the movie where a few humans have in some way busted out of their enslavement, and they actually are alive, they're awake. They are living in the real world, and they're watching most of humanity just asleep in this world of fantasy. They find Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, and they meet Neo in his imaginary world, and they offer to him the opportunity, a choice, to wake up, to actually join the real world, or to forget about the invitation, to fall asleep, and to live the rest of his life asleep in this imaginary world. And of course, the movie hinges on Neo's decision on whether he wants to wake up to see what's really going on, to live life actually in reality, or if he wants to spend the rest of his life in this fantasy world, which really doesn't exist. Now, it's a harsh commentary on humanity, but in some way, the movie, which has Christian roots and a Christian lens, is actually painting a phenomenon that I do think exists in our world and in our culture. And that is, boy, it's really easy for us to lose sight of what's the real world and to get caught up in things in life. And then the next thing you know, one thing leads to another. 1 year passes, and you just find yourself just kind of caught up and exhausted, looking for Christ in your life and looking for reality, looking for meaning, but almost just like the people in the Matrix, kind of asleep and wondering what is the meaning of life or the reality of life. In number 3 in the notes, there's a great quote from Christopher West's book, Theology of the Body Explained, which of course is commenting on John Paul II's theology. And he says this, he says, without reference to God's original plan and its hope for restoration in Christ, people tend to accept discord as just the way it is. What is he saying there? He says that if we don't understand why we were made in the beginning, then we're going to easily accept life as it is now as just the way it is. If we don't know that there's actually something better for us or something more fulfilling for us, then we're just going to accept life as we know it now as just the way it is. In other words, if we're sleeping and everybody else is sleeping, and we don't know that we can actually be awake, if we don't realize that the world we're quote unquote living in is not the real world, then we can accept our lives as just the way it is. Continuing with the quote number 3, he says, when we normalize our fallen state, it is akin to thinking it normal to driving with flat tires. We intuit that something is amiss, but when everyone drives around in the same state, we lack a point of reference for anything different. So imagine that everybody's a car. If you could just say that for a second. Your life is a car. Big car, shiny car, but there's no air in the tires. And just imagine that if everybody around you had flat tires. And just imagine if we all thought that that was normal. And we just kind of cruise through life on flat tires and everybody else has flat tires. And nobody ever told us or nobody ever showed us that there's actually supposed to be air in the tires. Imagine what life would be like if all we had was flat tires and we thought that that's what life was supposed to be about. And then imagine if somebody introduced you to air and your tires were inflated and you could actually drive the car the way that it was supposed to be driven. Number 4, quotes a movie, The American President, that says, when people are thirsty enough in the desert, they'll drink the sand when they see a mirage. And I think we live in a world that is hungry. I think we live in a culture that is thirsty. And when we're not presented with the right thing to drink or the thing that would satiate our hunger and our thirst, then I think we just grasp after the mirages. So let me tie these 4 quotes or images together and finalize the introduction here. I think you and I live in a culture where we've been grasping at the mirages in the desert for a long time. But at the same time, because we're made by God for God, we can't deny the fact that we're thirsty. And we just keep going back to the same mirages, hoping that those mirages would actually satiate our thirst. It's like we're all driving around with flat tires and we know that something's just not right, but we just keep driving the car with the flat tires, hoping that if we just shined the car or got a new stereo in the car or painted the car or put a convertible on the car, that would make it all better and that would actually fix what we know is the problem. But the fact is that the car needs air in the tires. It doesn't need another makeover. What happens is it's easy for us to live in a world where we're just kind of sleeping with everybody else. It's easy for us to live in a world where we live practically as if God doesn't exist, in this practical atheism. And God enters our life, He intervenes just like in the movie The Matrix, and He presents us an option. Do you want to wake up or do you want to keep sleeping? Do you want to experience life the way it's supposed to be lived? Do you want air in your tires? Or do you just want to keep sleeping and you want to keep going back to the life that you knew? With all of that as a very long introduction, I want to look at today's scriptures, again, on this 12th Sunday of Ordinary Time. And again, we find ourselves in the chapter 9 of the Gospel of Luke. Now, earlier in the first talk, we unpacked verse 20, which is, of course, Jesus asking them, who do you say that I am? And in this talk, what I really want to do is look at verse 23. And this is the line from verse 23. It's number 6 in the notes. He then said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. As Jesus invites His disciples to come after Him, He also invites them to be sober and alert about what's it going to cost in order for them to follow Him. So it's important to feel the rub here. I hope you feel a little tension in your heart. I hope you feel a little resistance, or that you're honoring the resistance that's there, because I don't think there's any line in Scripture that's more countercultural or that I think stings the secularized American Catholic conscience more than this single verse in 9:23. unless you deny yourself, unless you stop trying to save your life, you can't really come follow me. That's really what Jesus is saying. Jesus is inviting them to follow him. Look at verse 23 with me. How many times does he draw the listener to himself? He says, come after me. If anyone wishes to come after me. He wants them to come to him. He actually ends that first line in verse 23. He says to follow me. Jesus is inviting us in the midst of the tension and the sobriety of the statement. He's only saying it so that we would follow him, to be with him. But right there in verse 23 we read, he must deny himself. Jesus says, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself. What Jesus does is he put his crosshairs, he centers all of his energy right there on those words, and with it, he goes actually right at the heart of our Western culture that has almost elevated the self to become an idol. I think in the culture that we live in, to be honest with you, if we're going to have a sober, long, loving look at the reality of the world that you and I live in, it is so easy for us to place ourselves at the center of our existence. It's so easy for us to live life with it. It's just all about me. So Jesus, with his words today, he almost juxtaposes the most historic war within the history of humanity. The call to follow God and the desire to follow ourselves. The call to surrender to God and this movement within us to not to surrender to anybody. The invitation to put God as the center of life, and this resistance to that where we want to keep ourselves at the center of that. Now you might be saying to yourself, Father Mark, sign me up. I'm ready to follow Jesus. And a lot of these introductory remarks really don't hit home to you. Maybe they describe somebody that you know. And if you're there, if you're ready, if you don't have any reservations about following Jesus in reality, in the practical details of your life, then praise God. I just invite you to intercede for the rest of us, because when I look at my life, there's still in my life, if I really take a long, loving look at my life, there are areas of my life or moments in my life or thoughts in my heart that would resist following Jesus. So I think there's three reasons that the people might resist following Jesus. Three things that I've seen in the priesthood, three things that I've seen in just walking with people of why we might actually resist following Jesus. Let's take a look at those three reasons why people would resist following Christ. The first is they don't really think they need to. Really, like, what's the point of following Jesus? Like, my life is fine. Things are good. I'm relatively healthy. Got a nice house, have a good job. Retirement looks good. Kids are doing great in sports. Our family photo looks really attractive. And I'm involved in church. Like, there is this almost cosmetic, kind of managed, false sense of security that I think it's so easy for us to get seduced into. I think a lot of people in our culture really don't feel like they need to follow Christ because they don't see any need for God practically in their life. They're doing just fine without Him. So we go back to the first quote. What is the Holy Father talking about in this dangerous phenomenon for our faith that's risen in our time? Well, this is exactly what he's talking about. This practical atheism, where he says that for those who don't feel like they need to follow Christ, it's because either A, they think that God or religion is irrelevant, or they just like living as if God didn't exist. Again, that's what I think Christopher West is getting at in number 3 from the quotes when he's talking about the fact that so many people, I think, are driving around with flat tires, but they really like their car. Like, they love the shine on the paint job, they love the stereo that they put inside, and boy, they really like the bucket seats because they can recline well and they're just really comfortable there. It's so easy for us to focus on the car rather than the tires. It's so easy for us to focus on the shine rather than what the car is designed to do. Well, my brothers and sisters, like, our cars weren't meant to have flat tires. And what happens is, if you and I live our lives as if God didn't exist or as if we didn't need to follow Christ, then let me present, I think, what's going to happen to us. What will happen is we'll live life with flat tires, and as life unfolds, we're going to need more because we want more, because the more is what satisfies the ache within us, even though we don't admit that there's an ache to begin with. So we have to work more to surround ourselves with more, and then life just becomes one big diversion. It becomes one weekend holiday that gets us ready for a big vacation, which leads us into another shopping spree, which takes us into another buffet, which then takes us into another holiday and another vacation. And life just becomes one big diversion after another. And in between the diversions, life just becomes one damn thing after another. And you just get tired. You get tired of all of the energy that it takes to keep up with the diversions. And then we're constantly running from the quiet, constantly running from any significant aspect of solitude where we might not only get in touch with ourselves, but get in touch with something bigger than us. And in the midst of all of that, we'll hit midlife crisis. We'll come face to face with our addictions or somebody else's addictions. Then I think we just hit life and the fact that bad things happen to good people, and people get cancer or people die or people get sick, and then we just start asking questions about life with no real answers, and then we just get mad at life, and then we get tired of all of the energy that it takes for the diversions, and then at some point you just get tired of being tired. Ever been there? You know anybody there? You there now? Holy Father in August of 2006 said, number 7, if God does not exist, life is empty and the future is empty. And it's not empty of pleasure. I mean, you can chase pleasure all day long, but at some point, pleasure is not going to satisfy the deepest longings of your heart. No amount of pleasure is going to put air back in your tires. However, I think one of the reasons why people don't want to follow Jesus is because they don't really think they need to, but they can't deny the emptiness of flat tires. I don't think people can deny the emptiness in their life. So the first reason why people may not want to follow Jesus is because they don't think they need to. The second reason I think people may not want to follow Jesus is because they're afraid to. I think a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves, can acknowledge that there's some fear there. I think many of us are simply afraid, like, to really follow Jesus because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where He's going to take us. We don't know what He's going to, quote unquote, ask of us. We don't know what our husbands or our wives or our kids or our parents or our families or our friends are going to think if we begin to follow Jesus and they're not following Jesus. And we don't know what we're going to do, perhaps with the tension that that might cause in our lives. I think a lot of us might be afraid of what might happen if Jesus accompanied us as we follow Him. In other words, I think a lot of us have secrets in our life. I think a lot of us have aspects of our past and our history that we're not proud of, that maybe we're even ashamed of. And you might just say that that door is closed in our life. And I think that for a lot of people, they're afraid of what Jesus would think if He actually came in contact with their secrets. If people are deathly ashamed of what has happened, gosh, what is God going to think? And so I think a lot of times our own shame or our own guilt or our own fear of what would Jesus think actually prevents us from following Him. And I think another thing that pops up in the fear is this, and this is something that I really had to face in my own life. You know, if I follow the Lord and if I really give my heart to Christ, if I take a risk and I start putting air in my tires, then I actually have to come face to face with, in some way, I was lied to a little bit. You know, for those of us who grew up in the West and we heard the worst from the Western secular culture, which told us that life is all about the shine of the car, the paint job on the car, the model of the car, all the amenities inside the car. That's what the world told us. And what if they're wrong? What if it's not about that? Maybe it's about putting air in the tires so that the car can go somewhere. so that the car is free to experience the road and the highway and the travel. But if you and I were told that life is all about the shimmer of the car and not about the air and the tires, then we have to come face to face with the fact that, gosh, we were lied to by the culture. And I think a lot of people don't want to admit that. And I think a lot of us, because we're surrounded by so many other people who are choosing to stay asleep in the matrix, you might say, that it's just sometimes easier, even though we know there's supposed to be air in the tires, there's supposed to be more out of life. I think it's just easier for us just to stay there. So some people resist following Christ because they don't really think they need Him. Some people resist following Christ because they're afraid to. And I think the third reason why some people resist following Christ is because they just don't know how. Like, how do you do that? I think a lot of times as I pray and as a lot of people pray, you sit down and you pray and God seems silent. And when we perceive Him to be silent, we perceive Him to be distant. And so people question, is God real or not? You know, this physical world, quote unquote, is easier to touch, taste, and feel than, quote unquote, the spiritual world. Now, we know that those two dimensions are integrated with each other, but just for the sake of the analogy, I think it's easier for us to live in the, quote unquote, world than it is to commit to a serious life where we're trying to deepen our relationship with Christ in that, quote unquote, invisible spiritual world. You know, I think that we've lost the capacity for relationship. I think all the smartphones and all the texting and all the emails and the computers and all the other gadgets and gizmos that we have is we live in a culture that it's hooked on information but doesn't know what wisdom is. I think we live in a culture that knows how to transfer comments but doesn't know how to really communicate. So I can send you an email, but I don't have to face you. I can send you a text, but I don't have to relate with you. And so what happens is we don't know how to be in relationship. I think that what's happening as we become more accustomed to non-relational forms of communication, then that's going to impact our relationship with God. And when it comes to having a relationship with God, I think a lot of us just don't know how to do that. So here's the tension, and building some tension here in talk number 2. Do we want to follow Jesus? Well, if we don't feel like we need a God in our life, then we're probably not going to want to follow Jesus. Or if we're afraid to, we're probably like the rich young man, not going to want to follow Jesus. Or I just don't know how. And so like Zacchaeus, we're just going to kind of live our lives far from the Lord. So with all of that presented, like here's the good news, here's the truth. Number 8, the Holy Father continues the quote that I gave you in number 7. He says, if God does exist, then everything changes. Life is light, our future is light, and we have guidance for how to live. Like, let's go back to today's gospel from Luke 9. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Like, He has come so that you might have life to the full, that your joy might be abundant and vibrant and alive, that you might have peace in your life. Look at what He said in the Gospel of Luke when He defined who He is. The quote right there for number 9, that He has come to bring liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. Like, what would your life look like if you had recovery of your sight and you could see Him and you could see what life was all about? What would your life look like if you were liberated from the things in your life that enslave you, where you were liberated from your sin, if you were liberated from your fear, liberated from anything that would prevent you from living life in peace and freedom? Like, Christ has come for that. That's His mission statement. So here's the good news. God does exist, and everything does change when we follow Him. Life is light, our future is light, and we have guidance on how to live. So the invitation to follow Him is not just an invitation to watch him walk down a road or simply observe Jesus doing things. No, when we follow him, we are in communion with him. And when we are in communion with him, we are in communion with somebody who is who he says he is. And that is the Savior of the world, our God who has become one of us, who has authority over all things, and who can change our life, restore our life, and transform our life. When we follow the Lord, he can transform our marriages. When we follow the Lord, he can transform our families. When we follow the Lord, he can transform your life. Secular Catholicism cannot transform your life. The Western culture that we live in, with its relentless pursuit of pleasure, cannot transform your life. And come on, has watching Jesus from afar really met your expectations? What would your life look like if you followed him? Your families, your marriages, your whole disposition toward just being alive. Like, what would your life look like? Jesus Christ, who looked at Bartimaeus and said, like, what do you want me to do for you? Quote number 10, Ephesians 3:20, that God can do immeasurably more in our lives than we could ever ask or imagine. You want that in your life? Do you want transformation in your life? Do you want peace and freedom in your life? Do you want to follow him? Let's spend some time asking the question, but let's spend some time asking the question with him who has proposed the question to us. Pick up on part 3 of the series as we look at the 13th Sunday of Ordinary Time, and we look at practical ways that we can begin to, in our daily life, follow him. Until then, let's ask the question, are we ready? Do we want to follow him? And until then, let's keep praying for each other. God bless you.